Hey friends, prayer is a spiritual discipline that is central to our lives. As a matter of fact, Richard Foster says that prayer catapults us, into the frontier of spiritual life. Why? Because prayer is the central spiritual discipline for Christians. Prayer is actually perpetual communication with God, consistent and constant communication with God. Prayer is us talking to God and God talking to us. Prayer is, it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. I talk, God talks. God talks, I talks. I talks, I talk. You talk and I listen. Prayer is a lifestyle posture. It's a place of constancy and consistency. You don't have to wait to get to church to go pray. Paul says, man ought always pray and never faint. You don't have to wait till you get to the sanctuary to get with the intercessors, but you can always have a consistent posture of prayer. You can always talk to God. You can be walking around talking to God. You don't have to get deep and fall all on the ground, but talking to God is a necessity. I believe if you talk to God in good times, when bad times come along, you've been talking to him so much that you don't have to start the conversation all over again. I kind of believe that sometimes the reason why people have a tough time in prayer is because it's kind of like, when you have a friend that you never talk to, and then you never return their calls. And then when you have something, when you need something, and they're the one that has something you need, then you call them, and instead of getting right to the point, you have to fluff them up with all these, hey, how you doing? What's going on? I was thinking about you. And you say all these things, and then you finally beat around the bush. Why? Because you're trying to get back in good with them. And many times I believe that's why people are always trying to get back in good with God, because they don't spend time talking to him. And so then when you need something from God, you spend all this time trying to fluff him up in need. But when you're in constant prayer with him, he already knows your needs because you've been talking to him on a consistent basis. So prayer is constant communication. Paul says, maintain your posture. Maintain your communication. Man ought always pray. Maintain that posture. But there's so many other things of prayer. But lastly, in this Passion Week, as we look at it, prayer creates in us a desire to want what God wants. Prayer creates in us a desire to want what God wants. James says in James 4:3, he says, you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. The reason why you don't receive is because you don't spend time with God, and so you ask for the wrong stuff. When you spend time in prayer with God, when somebody needs healing because you've been talking to God and God's been talking to you, then you don't come praying crazy prayers because you already know the kind of stuff that God does. You already know the kind of stuff that God wants. You have a preview into how God wants to move on their lives and in your life. And so therefore, when you're praying for certain things, you already know what to pray, because when you're praying and God's talking to you and you're talking to him and he's showing you through his word, you know how to move. When you wait to pray, you will only pray for what you want because all you know is what you want. But when you're in constant communication with God, you know what God wants. And so now when you're talking to him, asking him to bring certain things to pass, you're already in your knower, as my father would say, because you know what God wants. And when you maintain a posture of communication and dialogue with the Father, you begin to ask rightly because you know what he wants, because you've been talking to him. You've been sharing in prayer with God and he with you. So I want to encourage you this week, this Passion, this Holy Weekend, began to establish yourself a lifestyle, a posture